You have met someone who genuinely believed they were a hero. Maybe it was a parent who controlled everything because they thought they knew best. Maybe it was a boss who crushed every idea around them because they believed only they could see the truth. Maybe it was a friend who hurt you and then explained very calmly why what they did was actually good for you. Now, scale that up. Scale it up to one man, one country, 50 million dead. Adolf Hitler did not think he was a monster. He thought he was a savior. That is not a defense. That is not a provocation. That is the most terrifying thing about him. Because when you understand how a human mind convinces itself that mass murder is righteousness, you stop asking how Hitler happened. You start asking how it keeps happening, and you start noticing the early signs everywhere. So let us go back to the beginning, not the bunker, not the rallies, the beginning. You are born in a small Austrian town in 1889. Your father is a customs official, strict, cold, violent. Your mother is soft and devoted, and she dies of breast cancer when you are 18 years old. Historians like John Toland and Ian Kershaw have documented in extraordinary detail how this early rupture never healed. You are now an orphan, a failed art student, a drifter sleeping in a Viennese homeless shelter. The city you dreamed of conquering with your paintings has rejected you twice. This is where the story usually gets skipped over. People jump straight to the beer hall speeches and the swastika armbands. But the key to everything that followed is not power, it is humiliation. Psychologist James Gilligan spent 30 years studying men who committed acts of extreme violence. His conclusion, published in his landmark work on violence and shame, was almost always the same. Violence is not born from hatred alone. It is born from shame that has no other exit. The man who cannot grieve, cannot process failure, cannot accept that the world does not owe him greatness, will eventually find another explanation, and that explanation will always involve an enemy. For Hitler, the enemy arrived on schedule. Vienna at the turn of the 20th century was a city seething with ethnic anxiety. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was fracturing. Nationalism was rising across every corner of Europe, and in that environment, a young, humiliated man who spent his days reading cheap political pamphlets and staring at his own reflection began to absorb a very old, and very poisonous idea. The idea was this: he had not failed, he had been sabotaged. His art had not been rejected because of its limitations. It had been suppressed. The professors who turned him away, the editors who ignored him, the culture that did not recognize his genius, these were not neutral forces. They were part of a coordinated attack. And once that framework was in place, every subsequent failure confirmed it. Every disappointment became evidence. Every humiliation became proof. This is what cognitive scientists call the attribution error spiral. Historian Robert Paxton, in his foundational study of fascism, describes it as the moment ideology becomes identity. You are no longer a person who failed. You are a person who was wronged, and being wronged, especially on a cosmic scale, does not require a solution. It requires a reckoning. By the time Hitler left Vienna, he had his enemy, he had his mission, and he had something even more dangerous. He had a story about himself that made sense. The great unrecognized artist, the lone visionary in a corrupted world, the one man who could see what others were too weak or too compromised to acknowledge. Then the First World War arrived and everything shifted. You need to understand what the war did to Germany, not just the military defeat, the specific nature of how that defeat landed. Germany surrendered in November 1918 while its army was still on foreign soil. No Allied soldier had crossed into Germany. No German city had been bombed. To millions of ordinary Germans, especially men who had spent 4 years in the trenches watching their friends die, the loss was incomprehensible. How do you lose a war your soldiers were still fighting? The answer, for those who needed one, arrived quickly. It was called the stab in the back myth. Germany had not lost. Germany had been betrayed by socialists, by defeatists, by Jews. The Dolchstoßlegende, as it was known in German, was not invented by Hitler. It was already circulating before he adopted it, but he did something no one else had done with it. He systematized it. He made it the spine of an entire political movement. And here is the part that most people gloss over. He believed it. This is the crucial distinction between Hitler and many of the people around him. Figures like Joseph Goebbels were sophisticated propagandists who understood they were manufacturing perception. Heinrich Himmler was a bureaucrat of atrocity, organized and methodical. Hermann Göring was an opportunist who craved luxury and power. These men were cynics in different degrees. Hitler was not. Hitler was a true believer. Political psychologist Harold Lasswell, writing in the 1930s as he watched fascism rise across Europe, warned that the most dangerous political actors were not those who used ideology as a tool. They were those who had become the ideology, who could no longer separate their personal wounds from their political convictions, for whom the movement was not a means to an end, but the only coherent story their life had ever told. Think about what this means. If you are a cynical manipulator, you can be reasoned with, bribed, or outmaneuvered. If you genuinely believe you are saving civilization, none of those levers work. Every obstacle confirms your mission. Every opponent confirms the conspiracy. Every atrocity becomes necessary, even noble, even sacred. By 1923, Hitler was standing in front of crowds of thousands and describing with absolute certainty the invisible force that was strangling the German people. By 1933, he was chancellor. By 1935, German Jews had been legally stripped of citizenship. By 1939, the war had begun, and at every step the internal logic held. Not logic you or I would recognize, not logic that survives contact with reality, but an internal logic that was perfectly consistent with the story he had been telling himself since he was a 19-year-old sleeping in a shelter in Vienna. Sociologist Hannah Arendt, who covered the Nuremberg trials and later wrote what many consider the defining philosophical account of totalitarianism, introduced a concept that has echoed through political thought ever since. She called it the banality of evil. People have often misunderstood this phrase. They think it means evil is ordinary. It does not mean that. It means that evil is often performed by people who are not grappling with it as evil at all. They have framed it as duty, as patriotism, as biological necessity, as saving the world. Hitler had framed mass murder as salvation. In his speeches, in Mein Kampf, in private conversations recorded by those around him, the language is always the same. Germany is sick. Germany is being poisoned. His role is that of a physician, a surgeon, a man willing to do what soft and sentimental men refuse to do. He is not killing, he is curing. He is not destroying, he is purifying. And the cruelest part of all this is what it reveals about human cognition. The mind is not designed to process itself as the villain. It is designed to survive. And survival, when survival feels threatened, comes first. The story always tilts in your favor. The opponent is always slightly more monstrous than they are. Your own cruelty is always slightly more justified than it was. Most people experience this at a small scale. A fight with a partner where you somehow remember your words as more reasonable than they were. A confrontation at work where the other person's error was somehow sharper in your memory than your own. You do not do this consciously. Neither did the people who followed Hitler. Neither, in his way, did Hitler himself. Scale that ordinary human tendency up by a factor of millions. Add economic collapse, national humiliation, a propaganda apparatus without precedent in human history, and a charismatic speaker who had honed his rage into a performance art. You get the 20th century's greatest catastrophe. The disturbing truth is not that Hitler was an alien aberration who arrived from outside human experience, The disturbing truth is that he assembled his worldview from materials that exist in every human mind: victimhood, conspiracy, moral certainty, the belief that your suffering justifies your response, the conviction that you can see what others cannot. None of these things are uniquely German. None of them are uniquely historical. Every time a leader describes their nation as uniquely victimized, every time a political movement defines itself entirely against an internal enemy, every time cruelty is repackaged as strength or purging is repackaged as purification, the same architecture is being assembled, not always to the same conclusion. Sometimes it is stopped, sometimes the institutions hold, sometimes the courts push back, or the press stays loud, or enough ordinary people decide that the story being told does not match the world they can see with their own eyes. But it starts the same way. It always starts the same way, with someone who genuinely, completely, absolutely believes they are saving the world. You probably know someone who believes something like that right now, at a much smaller scale, in a much more ordinary life. Someone who has turned their wounds into a worldview, someone whose explanation for every failure points outward and never inward, someone who would tell you with complete sincerity that everything they do, no matter how much it damages the people around them, is ultimately for the good. That is the person to watch, not the openly cruel, the sincerely certain, because the night is always darkest just before someone who has convinced themselves they are the dawn.